The gavel slammed down with a finality that shattered my world. "Guilty," the judge announced, his voice devoid of emotion. I couldn't breathe. The courtroom spun around me as officers approached, cold metal handcuffs biting into my wrists. Yesterday, I was Marcus Johnson, respected high school coach with a family and future. Today, I was a convicted rapist. My wife's sob pierced the stunned silence, but I couldn't turn to look at her one last time. Someone shouted, "Monster!" from the gallery. The victim's family embraced, their relief palpable while my own life crumbled. "You'll serve 25 years, the judge continued, but his words sounded distant, underwater. 25 years for a crime I never committed. What I didn't understand then, as they led me away in chains, was that my conviction had been secured months before I ever stepped foot in that courtroom. I was just a pawn in a game where justice was merely a convenient fiction. I used to believe in the system. That's the cruel irony of it all. As an African-American man raised in Cincinnati's West Side, I'd grown up hearing warnings about police and courts, but I'd convinced myself those were stories from another time. I'd done everything right. College degree, steady career, a home in the suburbs. At 34, I was 6 years into my dream job as head track coach at Westland High, with a reputation for turning troubled kids into scholarship athletes. My wife Janelle and I had just celebrated our 8th anniversary. We met in college. She was studying sports medicine when I was on the track team. Now she managed a physical therapy clinic while I coached. We bought our first house 2 years ago, a modest 3-bedroom in a good school district. Perfect timing too, since our son Elijah had just turned 5 and would start kindergarten in the fall. "You're going to be even busier next year," Principal Wallace told me that spring afternoon, smiling as she slid the paper across her desk. I'd been approved to start a summer training program for at-risk youth from neighboring districts. The grant would add nearly $10,000 to my annual salary. I remember calling Janelle immediately. "We can finally start saving for that Disney trip," I told her, "and maybe put a down payment on a minivan," she laughed. "One step closer to full suburban cliché status." That night, we celebrated with takeout and wine after Elijah went to bed. Simple pleasures that I'd give anything to experience again. Looking back, there were signs I should have noticed, like when Officer Dennison would slow his patrol car whenever he drove past me jogging in our neighborhood, or how Mrs. Caldwell from 3 doors down would clutch her purse tighter when we passed in the grocery store. I'd grown so accustomed to these microaggressions that they had become background noise in my life, hardly worth mentioning. At school, I'd occasionally catch snippets of conversations that stopped when I approached. Rebecca Wells, our new English teacher, seemed particularly uncomfortable around me. I attributed it to her being new, perhaps nervous around colleagues. I later learned she'd filed a complaint that I'd looked at her inappropriately in the teacher's lounge. The administration dismissed it, but it remained in a file I knew nothing about. That April evening, I was working late, reviewing applications for the summer program. The school was mostly empty. I remember checking my watch, 7:15 p.m. I should have been home an hour ago, but I wanted to finalize the student list before the weekend. As I was locking my office, I noticed the light on in the girls' locker room. School policy mandated checking any unusual activity, so I called out before approaching the door. "Hello? Anyone still here? Building's closing soon." No answer. I radioed Jeff, the security guard, but he was making rounds on the other side of campus. "Just check it out," he said through the static. "Probably some team forgot to turn off the lights." I knocked again, louder this time. When there was still no response, I pushed the door open slightly, still calling out. That's when I heard the sobbing. "Hello? Is everything okay in there?" I stepped just inside the doorway. Through the rows of lockers, I glimpsed a girl sitting on a bench, hunched over. I recognized her instantly. Kayla Bennett, a sophomore sprinter with tremendous potential, who'd been struggling with her times lately. "Kayla, what's wrong?" I kept my distance, uncomfortable being alone with a female student, especially in the locker room. She looked up, startled, eyes red and swollen. "Coach Johnson, I'm sorry, I just needed a minute." "It's past 7, you should have gone home hours ago, is everything all right?" She wiped her eyes quickly. "Yeah, just stressed about regionals, and some stuff at home." "Want me to call your parents, or we can talk in my office?" "No," she interrupted, suddenly panicked. Please don't call home. I'm fine, really. She gathered her things quickly. I should go. She hurried past me, and I noticed bruising on her arm that looked like fingerprints. I'd been coaching long enough to recognize the difference between sports injuries and something more concerning. Kayla, I said gently, if someone's hurting you, we can get help. Nobody's hurting me, she snapped, then softened. Sorry, Coach, I'm just tired. I walked her to the front entrance, watching her get into an unfamiliar car waiting in the parking lot. I couldn't see the driver clearly, but something felt wrong. I should have reported it immediately, but decided to speak with our guidance counselor first thing Monday morning. Before heading home, I stopped at Rivera's liquor store to pick up a bottle of Janelle's favorite red wine. The security camera captured my face clearly as I paid. The clerk, Mr. Rivera, made small talk about the weather while bagging my purchase. Have a good weekend, Coach, he said as I left. If I had driven straight home instead of stopping for that wine, if I hadn't entered that locker room alone, if the security camera hadn't placed me exactly 3 miles from where Kayla Bennett would be attacked less than 30 minutes later, perhaps I'd still be a free man today. But I made those choices, innocent as they were, and those choices would soon be twisted into evidence of my guilt in a story I never wrote, yet somehow starred in. Let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from, and if you've ever known someone who went through a similar situation. The knock came at 5:17 a.m. 3 sharp raps that jolted me from sleep. Through our bedroom window, blue and red lights pulsed against the pre-dawn darkness. Marcus? Janelle whispered, fear edging her voice. Stay here with Elijah, I said, pulling on sweatpants. My heart hammered in my chest, but I wasn't afraid. Not yet. Whatever was happening, I assumed it was a mistake or emergency in the neighborhood. 2 police officers stood on my porch, hands resting near their holsters. Behind them, a plainclothes detective stepped forward. Marcus Johnson? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Yes, that's me. What's going on? Detective Paul Harmon, Cincinnati PD. We need to ask you some questions regarding an incident that occurred last night. What incident? It's better if we discuss this down at the station. I noticed my neighbor across the street watching from his window. Can't we talk here? I have a wife and son. Sir, one of the uniformed officers interrupted, we strongly suggest you cooperate. Detective Harmon's expression softened slightly. It's just routine questioning, Mr. Johnson. The sooner we clear this up, the sooner you can get back to your family. I believed him. That was my first mistake. At the station, they led me to a small room with a metal table bolted to the floor. No windows, just a mirror I assumed was two-way. I sat there for nearly an hour before Harmon entered with another detective, a woman who introduced herself as Detective Reyes. Do you know a student named Kayla Bennett? Harmon began without preamble. Yes, she's on the track team I coach. When did you last see her? I explained our encounter in the locker room, emphasizing that I'd followed protocol by calling out before entering and keeping my distance. And why were you alone with a 16-year-old girl in a locker room after hours? The question's implication hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't alone with her. I heard someone crying and checked if they needed help. So you admit entering the girl's locker room while she was inside? Yes, but not like you're suggesting. Reyes slid a photograph across the table. Kayla in a hospital bed, her face bruised, eye swollen shut. What happened to her? I asked, genuinely horrified. She was sexually assaulted last night, Harmon said flatly, around 8 p.m., about half a mile from Westland High. That's terrible. But what does this have to do with me? Kayla says you followed her from school. The accusation was so absurd I almost laughed. That's not true. I went straight home after seeing her. After stopping at Rivera's Liquor, Reyes corrected. Yes, to buy wine for my wife. You can check. We did, Harmon interrupted. We also checked the traffic camera at the intersection of Maple and Pine. Your car headed east after leaving Rivera's, away from your home, toward where Kayla was attacked. That's not possible. My mind raced. I always take Elm Street home. The light at Pine takes forever. They exchanged glances. Mr. Johnson, we have the footage. The questioning continued for hours. They asked about my relationship with Kayla, whether I'd ever texted her, given her rides, met outside of school. Each question carried an insinuation that made my skin crawl. "I want a lawyer," I finally said. "Only guilty people need lawyers," Harmon replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's not true, and you know it." My voice rose. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Then explain the DNA." My blood ran cold. "What DNA?" "The lab rushed preliminary results this morning. Male DNA was recovered from the victim. It's being compared to yours right now." "There won't be a match," I said confidently. "Because I didn't do this." Harmon leaned forward. "Here's what I think happened, Marcus. You've been watching Kayla, a pretty, vulnerable girl. You saw her alone, upset. Maybe you offered her a ride, and things got out of hand." "That's disgusting. I'd never—" "Your school district has a file on you," Reyes interjected. "A complaint from a female teacher about inappropriate behavior." "What? That's not—" "And we spoke with your neighbor. Says you often watch the teenage girls in the neighborhood when they walk home from school." I recognized the accusation. Mr. Peterson, who'd called the police last summer when Elijah and I were playing basketball in our own driveway. Who complained about loud music whenever Janelle's family visited. "That's a lie," I said, my voice shaking with anger and fear. "He doesn't like having black neighbors. Everyone knows he's racist." "Playing the race card already?" Harmon sighed, shaking his head like he was disappointed in me. When they finally let me call a lawyer, the only one I could afford was Ted Simmons, a public defender with bloodshot eyes and a caseload visible in the slump of his shoulders. "Don't say anything else," he advised after hearing my story. "They're fishing. Without physical evidence, they've got nothing solid." But there was physical evidence, just not mine. 3 days later, the DNA results came back inconclusive. Not a match to my DNA, but not a definitive exclusion either, due to what they called sample contamination. They arrested me anyway. The search warrant for my home and car yielded nothing, but the damage was already done. Local news ran my mugshot with headlines like, "High school coach arrested in student rape case." They always used my most recent DMV photo, where, by unfortunate coincidence, I was glaring at the camera, annoyed by the long wait. My principal called Janelle, not me, to say I was suspended pending investigation. "It's just procedure," she assured my wife, but her tone said otherwise. The prosecution's case built steadily on circumstantial evidence. My presence at school, the liquor store stop, the alleged traffic camera footage, Kayla's testimony that a large black man attacked her in the darkness, the inconclusive DNA, the previous complaint, my suspicious behavior with female students according to 2 teachers who suddenly remembered concerning interactions. Ted discovered the traffic camera at Maple and Pine had been malfunctioning that night. There was no footage of my car, but the prosecutor, Angela Kessler, simply pivoted. The defendant knew about the faulty camera and deliberately took that route to avoid detection. I watched helplessly as my life was interpreted through a lens of presumed guilt. Every innocent action became sinister with the right narrative. My concern for Kayla's bruises. I was assessing my target. The wine purchase? Liquid courage before the attack. My clean record. Careful planning to avoid suspicion. The final blow came when Jeff, the security guard who'd advised me to check the locker room, changed his statement. Now he claimed he'd told me to wait for him before entering. "Why would he lie?" I asked Ted, devastated by this betrayal. "He's 2 years from retirement. They probably threatened his pension." Ted looked exhausted. "Marcus, this isn't looking good. The prosecutor is offering a deal. Plead guilty to lesser charges, serve 8 to 10 years. "I didn't do it," I insisted. "I won't plead guilty to something I didn't do." They're building a narrative that fits their theory, not following evidence. And it's working. Black coach, white victim, in this county. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The preliminary hearing was brief. Judge Caroline Weber, known for her tough-on-crime stance, denied bail despite my lack of prior record and strong community ties. Her reasoning? The heinous nature of the crime and potential danger to students. As officers led me back to my cell, I caught Kessler smiling at Detective Harmon. That's when I finally understood. My conviction wasn't about justice or truth. It was about closing a case quickly, advancing careers, and reinforcing a narrative everyone was already primed to believe. To them I was never Coach Johnson. father and husband. I was just another black man who'd finally revealed his true nature. If this story is impacting you, like it right now. This helps our channel reach more people who need to know these realities of the judicial system. My trial began on a Tuesday morning, 9 months after my arrest. I'd spent those months in county jail, separated from other inmates due to the nature of my charges. Protective custody, they called it, though there was nothing protective about 23 hours daily in a cell, barely larger than my bathroom at home. Ted had managed to secure a suit for me to wear instead of the orange jumpsuit, but the illusion of dignity was shattered by the shackles around my ankles and the way the guards flanked me as I entered the courtroom. I felt every eye watching, judging. Whispers followed me to the defense table. "Don't look around," Ted had coached me. "Look respectful but confident. Make eye contact with the jury when appropriate, but don't stare." The jury. 12 people who would decide my fate. 7 women, 5 men, 10 white, 1 Asian American, 1 Hispanic. No black jurors despite Cincinnati's 43% black population. Ted had tried challenging the jury selection, pointing out that the prosecution had struck all 4 black potential jurors during voir dire. "The state has provided race-neutral reasons for their peremptory challenges," Judge Weber ruled, accepting Kessler's flimsy explanations that had nothing to do with race, but everything to do with the outcome she wanted. Janelle sat directly behind me, a silent pillar of support. Her parents had taken Elijah to stay with them in Cleveland, shielding him from the worst of it. My own parents, both in their 70s, couldn't bear to attend. "We know you're innocent," my mother had told me during her last visit. "We can't watch them do this to you." Kessler's opening statement painted me as a predator, hiding behind a respectable facade. Marcus Johnson carefully cultivated an image as a dedicated coach and family man, she told the jury. But beneath that mask was a man who abused his position of authority to target vulnerable young women. She outlined a damning timeline. I'd allegedly noticed Kayla's vulnerability, isolated her in the locker room, suggested meeting later, then attacked her in a secluded area near the school. The narrative was crafted to exploit every racial stereotype and fear: the hypersexual black man, the innocent white girl, the savage attack. Ted's opening statement emphasized my clean record, my family, and the lack of physical evidence connecting me to the crime. "The prosecution wants you to convict Marcus Johnson based on assumption and innuendo," he argued, "but they cannot show you a single piece of concrete evidence proving he committed this terrible crime, because he did not commit it." Kayla Bennett took the stand on the second day. She'd changed in the months since I'd last seen her. Her hair was different, her makeup more mature. She looked older than her 16 years as she swore to tell the truth. Her testimony was devastating in its detail. She described how I'd cornered her in the locker room, made suggestive comments, then suggested meeting later. How I'd followed her after she left school, forced her into my car, driven to a wooded area, and assaulted her. She cried at appropriate moments, her voice breaking. Something felt rehearsed about her testimony, but the jury wouldn't see that. They saw a traumatized young woman facing her attacker. When asked why she initially told police her attacker was a large black man, rather than specifically naming me, she explained she'd been too terrified to accuse a teacher directly. During cross-examination, Ted gently pressed on inconsistencies. Why hadn't she mentioned my car in her initial statement? How could she be certain it was me in the dark? Why hadn't she called for help when I allegedly approached her after school, when there were still students and staff around? "I was scared," she repeated, a phrase that became her shield against any logical inconsistency. "He said he'd hurt me worse if I told anyone." Watching her, I felt sick, not just because of her lies, but because something in her eyes reminded me of that evening in the locker room, that same hunted look. Whatever had happened to Kayla, whatever had caused those bruises I'd noticed before the attack, was still controlling her. She wasn't just lying, she was trapped in a story someone else had crafted. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from Detective Harmon, who emphasized my evasiveness during questioning. The school principal reluctantly testified about the complaint in my file, though she acknowledged it had been deemed unfounded. My neighbor described seeing me watch young girls in the neighborhood, never mentioning these girls were my son's playmates and their mothers. The forensic evidence, or lack thereof, should have been our strongest point. The DNA found on Kayla didn't match mine, but Kessler brought in an expert who testified that the sample was likely contaminated and that the lack of a match didn't exclude me as the perpetrator. In approximately 15% of sexual assault cases, this expert claimed, perpetrator DNA is not successfully recovered due to various factors including time elapsed before examination, washing, and collection techniques. Ted's cross-examination revealed this expert had been found unqualified in 3 previous cases and had published no peer-reviewed research. But the damage was done. The jury had heard what Kessler wanted them to hear. The lack of my DNA didn't mean I was innocent. Our defense case felt painfully inadequate. Ted called Janelle, who testified about my character, and confirmed I'd arrived home around 8:30 p.m. that night. But under Kessler's cross-examination, she had to admit she hadn't checked the time precisely and had been busy with Elijah. Mr. Rivera from the liquor store testified that I seemed normal when buying wine, not agitated or in a hurry. We presented evidence that the traffic camera Harmon had initially claimed captured my car had been non-functional for weeks. Our strongest witness should have been Dr. Elaine Morris, a forensic scientist Ted had somehow convinced to review the case pro bono. She methodically explained how the DNA evidence excluded me as the source, contradicting the prosecution's expert. Based on the samples analyzed, she testified, I can state with scientific certainty that Marcus Johnson is not the source of the male DNA recovered from the victim. But Kessler's cross-examination focused on Dr. Morris's activism with the Innocence Project and suggested she was biased against law enforcement. When Dr. Morris attempted to explain the science further, Judge Weber interrupted, instructing her to answer the questions directly without elaboration. As the trial progressed, I noticed a pattern. Judge Weber sustained nearly every objection Kessler raised, while overruling most of Ted's. She allowed the prosecution to introduce character evidence about me that should have been inadmissible, while limiting our defense witnesses' testimony. In closing arguments, Kessler reminded the jury of Kayla's emotional testimony. Ask yourselves, she said, why would this young woman put herself through this ordeal if it weren't true? Why would she subject herself to the trauma of facing her attacker in court? Ted emphasized the lack of physical evidence, the inconsistencies in testimony, and reminded the jury of the standard of reasonable doubt. If you cannot say with absolute certainty that Marcus Johnson committed this crime, and the evidence shows you cannot, then you must find him not guilty. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours. As they filed back into the courtroom, I studied their faces, searching for some hint of my fate. They avoided my eyes. I knew then what their verdict would be. On the charge of aggravated sexual assault in the 1st degree, we find the defendant, Marcus Johnson, guilty. The courtroom erupted in sound. Janelle's scream, someone's applause, the judge's gavel. I stood frozen, unable to process the words that had just destroyed my life. Marcus Johnson, Judge Weber intoned, you have been found guilty of one of the most heinous crimes in our society. You abused your position of trust as an educator to prey upon a student in your care. She continued, citing the particular depravity of my actions and my lack of remorse. I wanted to scream that I couldn't show remorse for something I hadn't done, but I remained silent as she announced my sentence, 25 years in state prison. As guards led me away, I caught a glimpse of Kayla sitting with a man I hadn't noticed before, older, well-dressed, hand possessively on her shoulder. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw something flash across her face. Not triumph or relief, but fear. 3 months earlier, I had been Coach Johnson, respected educator with a loving family and promising future. Now, in the eyes of the world, I was inmate, Dara 647891, a monster convicted of assaulting a child, sentenced to spend what should have been the best years of my life behind bars for a crime I never committed. Don't miss the continuation of this impactful story. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to be notified about the next episodes of this series about failures in the justice system. The intake process at Oakwood State Correctional Facility stripped away the last vestiges of my identity. Guards ordered me to strip naked in front of a dozen other new arrivals. They searched every crevice of my body, sprayed me with delousing chemicals that burned my skin, and handed me a set of faded blue prison uniforms with my inmate number stenciled across the back. "Keep your head down and your mouth shut," the intake officer advised as he handed me a thin mattress and scratchy blanket. "Sex offenders don't last long here if they draw attention." My first night, I lay awake listening to the cacophony of prison sounds, distant shouts, metal doors clanging, someone sobbing in a nearby cell. By morning, I'd made a decision. I would survive this. Not just exist, but find a way to prove my innocence. Reality quickly tested that resolve. Prison, I discovered, operated on strict racial hierarchies. White inmates clustered with whites, Latinos with Latinos, and black inmates with blacks. Crossing these invisible boundaries invited violence. As a black man convicted of raping a white girl, I occupied an especially dangerous position, distrusted by my own racial group, targeted by whites who saw my very existence as an affront. 3 days after arrival, I got my first lesson in prison politics. I sat at a table in the cafeteria where 4 other black inmates were already eating. "You can't sit here," one said quietly, not looking up from his tray. "Why not?" I asked, confused. "We don't mess with chomos." "Child molesters." "I didn't do what they say I did," I protested. A harsh laugh. "That's what all you pedos say." Later that day, I was cornered in a bathroom stall by 2 white inmates with crude tattoos and dead eyes. They held a sharpened toothbrush to my throat. "You like little white girls?" one hissed. I closed my eyes, certain I was about to die just weeks into my sentence. Then a voice from the doorway. "That's enough." A tall, muscular black man stood watching. Prison tattoos covered his arms, and a scar ran from his temple to jaw. "Tyrell wants to see him before you cut him up." My attackers hesitated, then backed away. "Your lucky day, coach," one spat. "But we'll be seeing you." The man who'd interrupted, Wilson, I later learned, led me to a corner of the yard where an older black inmate sat playing chess by himself. Tyrell Adams had been at Oakwood for 27 years of a life sentence. He controlled much of the black population in the prison through a combination of respect and fear. "Heard you're the coach who messed with that white girl," he said, without looking up from his chess game. "I didn't touch her," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm innocent." "Course you are." He moved a bishop. "You know how many innocent men are in here? About 80% if you ask them." Finally he looked up, eyes studying me. "Thing is, I believe you." Those 4 words changed everything. Tyrell took me under his protection, spreading word that I was off limits. In return, I began teaching him to read better, a skill he'd hidden his lack of for decades. "Man your age should know how to read proper letters from his grandbaby," he explained during our first session. "Can't let these young bloods know the OG needs help with ABCs." Life fell into a grim routine. Wake at 5:30 a.m., breakfast at 6. Work assignment from 7 to 11. I was assigned to the laundry, sorting and folding the endless piles of uniforms and bedding. Lunch at 11:30. More work until 4. Dinner at 5. Lock-in at 7. 22 hours of my day were scheduled, controlled, monitored. Janelle visited every Saturday, the 90-minute drive each way consuming her weekends. I watched her grow thinner, the strain etching new lines around her eyes. 6 months into my sentence, she stopped wearing her wedding ring. "The school let me go," she admitted during one visit. "They said budget cuts, but—" "It's because of me," I finished. The collateral damage of my convictions spread like ripples in water. "I got a job at a clinic in Dayton," she continued. "It's an hour commute, but it pays better." I nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying. Our savings were depleted. The house was probably next. "How's Elijah?" I always saved this question for last, both craving and dreading the answer. Her eyes grew wet. "He's having trouble at his new school. Some kids found out about you. They've been saying things." My son was 7 years old, bearing the weight of my conviction. "Tell him I love him," I said. the words wholly inadequate. He knows. She hesitated. Marcus, my parents think... They think it might be better if he doesn't visit for a while. The prison environment, seeing you like this... I swallowed hard. They're probably right. After 9 months, Janelle's visits became monthly instead of weekly. After 14 months, she arrived with paperwork. Divorce papers. I'll always believe in you, she said, tears streaming down her face. But Elijah needs stability, a normal life. I signed the papers with numb fingers. What right did I have to hold her to a marriage that had become a prison sentence for her too? Meanwhile, I turned my focus to my case. The prison library became my sanctuary. I spent every allowed moment there, learning legal terminology, studying case precedents, drafting appeals. I wrote letters to innocence projects, to lawyers, to journalists, anyone who might listen. Most went unanswered. My first appeal was rejected without a hearing. Insufficient grounds, the form letter stated. My court-appointed appellate lawyer had submitted a brief so cursory it barely mentioned the DNA evidence that should have exonerated me. During my 3rd year at Oakwood, I met Michael Reeves, a former paralegal serving time for fraud. He took an interest in my case, pointing out procedural errors I'd missed. Your trial was a masterclass in judicial bias, he said, reviewing my transcripts. The judge sustained 89% of prosecution objections, but only 34% of defense objections. That's appealable. With Michael's help, I prepared a more comprehensive appeal. While we worked, I continued teaching Tyrell to read, expanding to a small group of older inmates who'd never admit their illiteracy to others. You got a gift, Tyrell told me one day. Way you explain things makes sense even to an old con like me. A new warden arrived at Oakwood in my 4th year, Catherine Bell, with a reputation for reform. She implemented educational programs, including a GED prep course. When the assigned instructor quit unexpectedly, I volunteered. You're a sex offender, the deputy warden reminded me. Policy forbids contact with educational programs. I'm a convicted sex offender, I corrected. And I was a teacher for 10 years before that. You need someone who can teach math and science. I can. Surprisingly, Warden Bell approved my assignment. Teaching again, even in prison, even under guard supervision, gave me purpose. My students were men society had written off, many illiterate, most facing decades behind bars. Their progress became my measuring stick for time. One December evening, 5 years into my sentence, a guard delivered an envelope to my cell. Inside was a Christmas card with no return address. The message inside, in careful handwriting, I know the truth. You didn't hurt Kayla. Her stepfather did. I have proof. My hands shook as I read it again and again. For 5 years I'd maintained my innocence while searching for answers. Who had attacked Kayla? Why had she accused me? This card suggested both answers. I showed the card to Michael the next day. This could be the break you need, he said cautiously, or it could be nothing. Inmates get false hope mail all the time. I wrote back to the anonymous sender, addressing the letter to the postmark city and the first initial and last name from the card's signature, L. Martinez. I begged for more information, for the proof mentioned. Weeks passed with no response. Then, during a routine cell search, a guard confiscated the card as unauthorized correspondence. When I filed a grievance, the card mysteriously disappeared from the evidence log. I was nearly ready to dismiss it as a cruel prank when a new inmate arrived at Oakwood. Lorenzo Martinez, former bailiff at the county courthouse, convicted of accepting bribes, assigned to the bunk across from mine. You sent the card, I said that night, keeping my voice low. He gave an imperceptible nod. Wasn't sure I'd end up here. Figured the letter was safer. You said you have proof. Had, he corrected. They seized most of my papers when they arrested me, but I remember what I saw. Lorenzo had been the bailiff during my trial. Before that, he'd worked security at the courthouse for years, observing the daily parade of human drama. He'd noticed Kayla and her stepfather, Richard Mercer, during my trial. Something about how he controlled her, Lorenzo explained. Too possessive for a stepfather, and she was terrified of him, not you. I've seen enough abuse cases to recognize the signs. Did you tell anyone? Tried to. Mentioned it to Detective Reyes after I noticed bruises on the girl's arms during a recess. Next day I was transferred to another courtroom. He'd started digging on his own time, discovering that Mercer had a sealed juvenile record and had been investigated twice for domestic violence, though charges were dropped both times when his partners refused to testify. Then I found the bombshell, Lorenzo continued. 3 years before your case, when Mercer was living in Columbus, his stepdaughter from a previous marriage accused him of sexual abuse. Case was dismissed when the mother withdrew the accusation and moved the family out of state. This could prove my innocence, I breathed. It's circumstantial, Lorenzo cautioned. But yeah, it's a start. There's more, though. I think Detective Harmon and Mercer knew each other before your case. I found a photo of them at a police fundraiser 2 years earlier. The pieces began falling into place. Kayla's fear in the locker room, the bruises I'd noticed, her reluctance to call home, the unfamiliar car waiting for her. Perhaps Mercer had been abusing her for months. When I stumbled upon her in distress and noticed the signs, I became a threat. The attack that night wasn't random. It was designed to silence Kayla and eliminate me in one move. We need to get this information to someone on the outside, I said. Someone who can investigate. Lorenzo nodded grimly. I know a journalist who might listen. Guy who covered my case, seemed fair, asked hard questions. That night, I wrote a letter to James Franklin, investigative reporter at the Cincinnati Examiner. I included everything Lorenzo had told me, plus my own suspicions. 3 weeks later, a worn manila envelope arrived with my commissary items. Inside was a note. Looking into it. Stay strong. JF. For the first time in 5 years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. Hope. Do you know someone who was wrongfully accused or had problems with the judicial system? Share in the comments. Your experience could help others going through similar situations. Hope, I discovered, was a double-edged sword. It gave me reason to persevere, but made each setback more devastating. After James Franklin's initial response, months passed with no further contact. I wrote follow-up letters that received no replies. Had he abandoned the investigation? Had my letter even reached him? In my 7th year of imprisonment, I faced my harshest test yet. Warden Bell transferred to another facility, replaced by Howard Griffith, a by-the-book administrator with little interest in rehabilitation programs. He immediately reviewed all inmate assignments, flagging mine as inappropriate. Sex offenders teaching classes is a liability, he announced during my termination hearing. Request denied for reassignment. I lost not just the teaching position, but my primary purpose. Around the same time, Tyrell was transferred to a minimum security facility as part of a pre-release program. Without his protection, old threats resurfaced. Twice I was jumped in the yard, resulting in cracked ribs and a concussion. Janelle's visits had dwindled to twice yearly. During her Christmas visit that year, she brought news that felt like another conviction. I've met someone, she said, eyes fixed on the table between us. His name is David. He's good to Elijah. I nodded mechanically, my chest hollow. That's good. Elijah deserves that. Marcus, she began. It's okay, I interrupted. I want you to be happy. She finally looked up, tears streaming. You shouldn't be here. This isn't right. It was the closest we'd come to discussing my case in years. The subject had become too painful, an open wound we avoided touching. I'm going to get out, I promised, unsure if I still believed it myself. 2 weeks after Janelle's visit, a new inmate approached me in the library. Young guy, barely 25, nervously glancing over his shoulder. You Johnson, the coach, he whispered. I nodded cautiously. Someone told me to give you this. He slipped a folded paper into my book before walking away. The note was brief. Clinic visit tomorrow. Ask for Dr. Torres. I had no scheduled medical appointments, but I recognized an opportunity when I saw one. The next morning, I reported to the infirmary complaining of chest pain. After an initial screening, I was directed to an examination room where a middle-aged Latina woman in a white coat waited. Mr. Johnson, she said formally, closing the door. "I'm Dr. Elena Torres. I understand you're experiencing chest discomfort." She went through the motions of an examination while whispering, "I'm James Franklin's contact. The reporter is still investigating your case, but he needed a secure way to communicate." My pulse quickened. "Has he found anything?" "He's located Kayla Bennett. She's 23 now, living in Chicago. Her stepfather is in prison for assaulting his new girlfriend's daughter." The news hit me like a physical blow. Mercer had gone on to hurt another child, a crime that might have been prevented if anyone had listened to my suspicions years ago. "Is she willing to recant?" I asked. Dr. Torres shook her head. "Not yet. She's traumatized, afraid. But Franklin's gained her trust. She's starting to open up." She pressed a business card into my hand. "A legal clinic specializing in wrongful convictions. Call this number next week during your allowed phone time. Ask for Rebecca Chen. She's expecting you." Over the next 6 months, I had periodic updates smuggled through Dr. Torres or coded in letters that passed prison censorship. The Midwest Innocence Project had accepted my case, with attorney Rebecca Chen leading the investigation. They'd filed motions for DNA retesting using new techniques unavailable during my trial and requested the sealed records from Mercer's juvenile case. Meanwhile, James Franklin published a series of articles examining flaws in sexual assault investigations, subtly referencing aspects of my case without naming me directly. He was laying groundwork, building public awareness about how tunnel vision and racial bias could lead to wrongful convictions. 9 months into this clandestine process, Dr. Torres delivered the breakthrough. "Kayla's agreed to a recorded interview. She hasn't fully recanted, but she's acknowledged uncertainties about her identification." My hands trembled with a mix of hope and anger. Uncertainties? I've spent 8 years here because of her certainties. "I understand your frustration," Dr. Torres said gently. "But psychologically, recanting is incredibly difficult. It means admitting she participated in destroying an innocent person's life. That's a heavy burden." I knew she was right. Kayla had been a victim too, first of her stepfather's abuse, then of investigators who molded her trauma into a weapon against me. The legal process, once started, moved with excruciating slowness. The Innocence Project filed a petition for post-conviction relief based on newly discovered evidence, ineffective counsel during my trial, and the DNA retesting results, which conclusively excluded me as the source of the genetic material found on Kayla. The district attorney's office fought every motion, every request for hearings. The same system that had rushed to judgment in convicting me now dragged its feet in addressing its mistake. During my 9th year at Oakwood, I received a visitor I never expected, Detective Sophia Reyes. She sat across from me, the years having added gray to her hair and lines to her face. "I owe you an apology," she began without preamble. "I believed you were guilty. I was wrong." "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice harder than I intended. "I've retired from the force. I'm cooperating with the Innocence Project now. There are things about your investigation the court should know." She explained how Harmon had fixated on me immediately, dismissing alternative suspects. How evidence that didn't fit his theory was sidelined. How the prosecutor, Kessler, had instructed them not to document interviews with witnesses whose accounts contradicted Kayla's. "Why didn't you say something back then?" I demanded. She looked away. "I was 3 years from making detective. Harmon was my superior, and—" She hesitated. "I thought you were guilty. Black coach, white student. I'd seen that scenario play out badly before." "You saw what you expected to see," I said bitterly. "Yes." She met my eyes. "I failed as an investigator and as a human being. I can't give you back those years, but I can help set things right now." Reyes's testimony, combined with the DNA results and new evidence about Mercer's history, finally forced the court to grant an evidentiary hearing. Judge Weber, who had presided over my original trial, recused herself, citing a potential conflict of interest. The real reason, I suspected, was avoiding scrutiny of her previous rulings. The hearing was scheduled, postponed, rescheduled, and postponed again. Bureaucratic delays, procedural issues, court backlogs, the system seemed determined to move at its own pace, regardless of the human cost. During one particularly dark period after another postponement, I received a letter from Elijah, now 14 years old. the first direct communication from my son in nearly a decade. "Dear Dad," it began. "Mom told me everything about your case. I've been reading the articles by Mr. Franklin. I want you to know I believe you're innocent. I'm proud to be your son." Those words sustained me through the final push. After 10 years, 11 months, and 16 days of imprisonment, I was transported to the county courthouse for the evidentiary hearing before Judge Raymond Hayes. The courtroom looked smaller than I remembered. Or perhaps I had shrunk, compressed by the weight of lost years. Rebecca Chen argued masterfully, presenting the new DNA evidence, Reyes's testimony about investigative misconduct, and the pattern of abuse by Richard Mercer. Most powerful was Kayla Bennett's testimony. Now 25, she approached the witness stand with visible trepidation. She explained how her stepfather had been abusing her for months before the attack, how he'd threatened to kill her mother if she told anyone. After Coach Johnson saw me crying in the locker room, Richard was waiting in the car. He knew something was wrong. I had to tell him what happened, that Coach had noticed the bruises. Her voice shook. That night, he beat me worse than ever before. Then she paused, gathering strength. Then he sexually assaulted me and told me to say a black man had done it. He said if I didn't accuse Coach Johnson, he'd kill my mom and make it look like a black man did that too. She described how detectives had shown her photos of only black suspects, with mine prominent among them, how they'd asked leading questions and praised her when her answers implicated me, how the prosecutor had coached her testimony, instructing her to appear more certain than she was. "I've lived with this lie for 10 years, she concluded, tears streaming down her face. "I can't take it back or undo what happened to Coach Johnson. But I can tell the truth now. He never touched me. He never hurt me. He was the only one who tried to help me." The district attorney's office, faced with overwhelming evidence of my innocence, did not oppose our motion. 3 days after the hearing began, Judge Hayes delivered his ruling. This court finds that significant new evidence, not available at the time of trial, casts substantial doubt on the petitioner's conviction. Furthermore, evidence of misconduct in the original investigation undermines confidence in the verdict. Therefore, this court vacates the conviction of Marcus Johnson and orders his immediate release. The words seemed to come from a great distance. After nearly 11 years of fighting for this moment, I could barely comprehend it had arrived. Rebecca squeezed my shoulder, grinning through tears. "It's over," she whispered. "You're free." Not quite, I thought. The paperwork took another 7 hours. It was past midnight when I walked out of the county detention center, wearing donated clothes that hung loosely on my prison-thinned frame. A small group waited in the parking lot: Rebecca, James Franklin, Dr. Torres, and 2 figures that made my heart stop, Janelle and Elijah. My son had grown from a 6-year-old boy to a teenager I barely recognized. He hung back awkwardly as Janelle approached. "We wanted to be here," she said simply, "to welcome you home." After 12 years, 7 months, and 21 days, I heard the words I'd thought would never come. This court annuls the conviction and orders the immediate release of the defendant. But as I stepped into the cool night air of freedom, I knew that while the prison walls were behind me, the journey to rebuild my shattered life was just beginning. If this story is impacting you, share it with your friends and family. Many people have no idea how the system can fail innocent people. Leave a like to support this content. Freedom, I quickly discovered, was both a gift and a burden. The world had continued its relentless evolution during my incarceration. Smartphones had replaced flip phones. Social media dominated communication. Entire industries had transformed. At 47, I felt like a time traveler thrown into a future that had moved on without me. My first week after release, I stayed at a hotel paid for by the Innocence Project. Simple tasks overwhelmed me. I froze in the cereal aisle, paralyzed by too many choices after years of institutional food. The constant noise of traffic, music, and conversation assaulted senses attuned to the controlled sounds of prison. Sleep came in fitful bursts, my body still synchronized to institutional schedules and midnight counts. The Innocence Project arranged temporary housing and connected me with social services, but the practical challenges multiplied. I had no valid ID, no credit history, no recent employment references. My teaching license had expired. My health insurance was non-existent, despite developing hypertension and chronic back pain in prison. It's actually easier to reintegrate as a guilty man who served his time than as an exoneree, Rebecca explained during one of our meetings. Parolees get transitional services. Innocent people get an apology if they're lucky. Job applications became exercises in humiliation. The gap in my employment history raised immediate red flags, forcing me to explain my wrongful conviction again and again. Even with official exoneration documents, the stigma lingered. "We've decided to go with another candidate," became the refrain after interviews that initially seemed promising. No one said, "We don't hire people who spent a decade in prison," but they didn't need to. I finally found work at a community center in a neighboring county, teaching GED classes to at-risk youth. The director, a former defense attorney, understood my situation. The salary was barely above minimum wage, but it was a start. Housing proved equally challenging. Landlords ran background checks that still showed my arrest record despite the expungement. One apartment manager put it bluntly, "Look, I believe you're innocent, but my other tenants might Google you. I can't risk it." I ended up renting a small apartment in a rundown complex where the landlord didn't ask questions beyond, "Can you pay the deposit?" The walls were thin, the plumbing unreliable, but it was mine, the first space I could call my own in over a decade. Financial compensation for wrongful conviction varied dramatically by state. Ohio statute provided $50,000 per year of imprisonment, but only after a separate court declaration of actual innocence, a process that could take years. Meanwhile, I lived paycheck to paycheck, rebuilding my life from scratch at an age when most people are planning retirement. The psychological aftermath was perhaps hardest to navigate. Prison had rewired my responses to stress, authority, and conflict. I'd wake in panic from dreams of being back in my cell. Crowded spaces triggered anxiety. Simple disagreements escalated to fight-or-flight reactions in my mind. Post-traumatic stress is common among exonerees, my therapist explained during our sessions, covered by a non-profit for wrongfully convicted individuals. You survived a profound trauma. Recovery isn't linear. My relationship with Elijah developed slowly, carefully. Janelle had remarried during my 7th year in prison. Her husband David seemed decent, if understandably wary of my presence in their lives. They had a daughter together, a 7-year-old who knew me only as Elijah's other dad. Elijah and I started with supervised visits, then progressed to weekend outings, movies, basketball games, tentative conversations, building a bridge across the years we'd lost. At 15, he was caught between childhood and adulthood, navigating his own complex feelings about my absence and return. "Were you angry at me?" he asked during one of our drives. "For not visiting more when I was younger?" "Never," I answered truthfully. "I understood why your mom made that choice, and she was right. Prison wasn't a place for a child." He nodded, looking out the window. "The kids at school used to say stuff about you being a, you know." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that." "I punched Tommy Vickers in 6th grade for calling you a child molester," he admitted with a small smile. "Got suspended for 3 days. Worth it, though. I didn't know whether to be proud or heartbroken. My exoneration received far less media coverage than my conviction had. James Franklin's investigative series won a regional journalism award, but most outlets gave my freedom a brief mention, if any. The prosecutors who built the false case against me faced no consequences. Angela Kessler had become a judge herself. Detective Harmon had retired with full pension benefits. Richard Mercer, Kayla's abusive stepfather, was serving 15 years for assaulting another child, less than the 25 years I'd been sentenced to for a crime I didn't commit. The racial disparity wasn't lost on me or on the activists who used my case as an example of systemic bias. 6 months after my release, I received an invitation that changed my trajectory. The Ohio Innocence Network asked me to speak at their annual fundraising dinner. Terrified but determined, I shared my story with a room full of attorneys, donors, and fellow exonerees. The worst part wasn't losing my freedom, I told them. It was losing my identity. In prison, I wasn't Coach Johnson, or Marcus, or Dad. I was a number, a chomo, a statistic. Rebuilding your sense of self after that kind of erasure is perhaps the hardest part of freedom. That speech led to others. I found purpose in advocacy, joining a growing movement of exonerees fighting for reforms, compensation laws, accountability for prosecutors who withhold evidence, improved eyewitness identification procedures, support services for the wrongfully convicted after release. I also began working with a local non-profit, helping former inmates transition back to society. My experience as both an exoneree and a former educator gave me unique insight into the challenges they faced. One unexpected outcome of my advocacy was reconnecting with former students. Darius Williams, who had been on my track team the year of my arrest, reached out after seeing me on a local news segment. Now a physical education teacher himself, he invited me to speak to his classes about resilience and justice. "You were the reason I went into teaching," he told me. "Even when everyone said you were guilty, I remembered how you believed in me when no one else did." His words healed something broken inside me. As my second year of freedom approached, I faced a decision I'd been avoiding: whether to meet with Kayla Bennett. Her recantation had freed me, but the anger I felt toward her remained complicated. She had been a victim too, a child terrorized into false testimony, yet her words had stolen 11 years of my life. After much deliberation and therapy, I agreed to a meeting arranged by the Restorative Justice Program at the university. We met in a neutral space, with a trained facilitator present. The woman who entered the room bore little resemblance to the teenager from my memories or the poised witness from the evidentiary hearing. She seemed simultaneously older and younger than her 26 years, with shadows under her eyes and hands that couldn't stay still. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she began, voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you want this meeting?" I asked, more bluntly than I'd intended. She flinched but met my eyes. "To apologize, though I know it's not enough, and to tell you that seeing you fight for your freedom gave me the courage to finally tell the truth about Richard. You're the reason he's in prison now, instead of hurting more children." "That doesn't change what happened to me," I said. "No," she agreed. "Nothing can give you back those years." She hesitated. "I have a 5-year-old daughter now. Someday she'll learn what I did. I hope I can tell her I at least tried to make amends, however inadequate." I hadn't expected that, the realization that Kayla carried her own sentence, one without end or exoneration. We talked for nearly 2 hours. I asked the questions that had haunted me for years. She answered with painful honesty. Neither of us walked away healed, but something shifted. A door closed on questions that had lingered too long, unanswered. As I approached the 3rd anniversary of my release, I still struggled daily with the aftermath of my wrongful conviction. Some wounds will never fully heal. My career trajectory was permanently altered. Relationships were damaged beyond repair. Trust, in the system, in humanity, remains fragile. Yet I found purpose in the ruins of the life that was taken from me. My advocacy work has contributed to 2 legislative changes improving compensation for exonerees. The GED program I run has helped dozens of former inmates secure employment. Elijah has decided to study criminal justice in college, determined to change the system from within. They stole 15 years of my life that I'll never recover. But I won't allow them to steal my future too. My story isn't just about injustice, it's about truth that refuses to stay buried, no matter how long it takes. Did this story touch your heart? Share it with someone who needs to understand the challenges faced by innocent people after exoneration. Leave in the comments what you found most impactful, and if you know organizations that help wrongfully convicted people,